I should have stayed home that October night, wrapped in blankets, watching mindless television until sleep took me. Instead, I found myself driving down the desolate back roads of Enterprise, Mississippi, my headlights cutting through the suffocating darkness like knives through velvet. The decision to visit Stuckey's Bridge hadn't been mine alone. My college roommate Marcus had been obsessed with local ghost stories ever since we'd moved to the area for school. He'd spent weeks researching the legend, poring over old newspaper clippings and interviewing elderly locals who would cross themselves and change the subject whenever the bridge was mentioned. "It's just a story," I had told him repeatedly. "People love to create legends around old places." But Marcus was persistent, and eventually, his enthusiasm wore down my skepticism. The plan was simple: drive out to the bridge, take some photos, maybe record some audio, and prove once and for all that the stories were nothing more than small-town folklore designed to keep teenagers from partying in remote locations. How wrong I was. The October air was unseasonably cold that night, with a dampness that seemed to seep through my jacket and settle into my bones. As I drove deeper into the countryside, the modern world seemed to fall away, piece by piece. First, the streetlights disappeared, then the houses became fewer and farther between, until finally, there was nothing but endless stretches of pine forest on either side of the narrow road. Marcus sat in the passenger seat, practically vibrating with excitement. His digital camera hung around his neck, and he clutched a small voice recorder in his lap like a talisman. In the back seat, we'd packed a cooler with energy drinks, flashlights, and what Marcus called ghost hunting equipment, though it looked more like junk from Radio Shack to me. "Turn left at the next dirt road," Marcus said, consulting the hand-drawn map an old man at a gas station had reluctantly provided after Marcus had bought $40 worth of snacks and promised we were just curious about local history. The dirt road was barely wide enough for my Honda Civic, and branches scraped against the windows as we made our way deeper into the woods. The headlights illuminated nothing but tree trunks and shadows that seemed to shift and move just beyond the light's reach. Every few seconds, I caught glimpses of yellow eyes reflecting back at us, probably just raccoons or possums, I told myself, though something primitive in my brain whispered otherwise. "Are you sure this is right?" I asked, gripping the steering wheel tighter as we hit another pothole that sent us bouncing in our seats. "The old guy said it was about 2 miles down this road," Marcus replied, but I could hear uncertainty creeping into his voice for the first time all evening. That's when we saw it, a break in the trees ahead, and beyond that, the faint outline of an old bridge silhouetted against the star-filled sky. Even from a distance, there was something wrong about it. The structure seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, creating a dark void in the landscape that made my eyes water when I tried to focus on it directly. "There it is," Marcus whispered, and I heard something in his voice that hadn't been there before, a note of unease that matched the growing dread in my chest. I pulled the car to the side of the road about 50 yards from the bridge, parking behind a cluster of scraggly bushes that provided some cover. The engine's silence was immediately filled by the sound of the night, crickets, the distant hoot of an owl, and something else I couldn't quite identify. A low humming that seemed to come from the direction of the bridge itself. "Do you hear that?" I asked Marcus as we gathered our equipment. He paused, tilting his head to listen. "Hear what?" But even as he asked, I could see from his expression that he heard it too. We stood there for a moment, listening to that strange, almost musical humming that seemed to rise and fall like breathing. It was then that I noticed something else: the normal sounds of the forest, the crickets and night birds, had gone completely silent. "Maybe we should come back during the day," I suggested, but Marcus was already walking toward the bridge, his flashlight beam dancing ahead of him. "Come on," he called back. "We drove all this way. Besides, ghost stories are always better at night, right?" Against every instinct in my body, I followed him. The bridge loomed larger as we approached, and I could see why it had inspired so many ghost stories over the years. Built sometime in the 1920s, according to Marcus's research, it was a narrow concrete and steel structure that spanned a deep creek. The railings were rusted and broken in several places, and weeds grew up through cracks in the roadway. But it wasn't the bridge's decrepit condition that made my skin crawl, it was the way it seemed to emanate a palpable sense of wrongness. As we got closer, I could make out dark stains on the concrete that could have been anything: rust, algae, or something far worse. The humming grew louder, and I realized it was coming from beneath the bridge, rising up from the dark water below like some kind of twisted lullaby. The legend says that old man Stuckey used to live in a cabin on the other side of this bridge, Marcus said, his voice hushed as we approached the structure. Back in the 1920s and 30s, he would flag down travelers, especially during bad weather, and offer them shelter for the night. I already knew the story, Marcus had told it to me a dozen times, but hearing it here, in this place, gave it new weight. According to local folklore, Jeremiah Stuckey had been a friendly old hermit who helped stranded motorists. What the travelers didn't know was that Stuckey had a darker side. Once he had lured them to his cabin, he would rob and murder them, then dispose of their bodies in the creek below the bridge. They say he killed more than 20 people before someone finally caught on, Marcus continued as we stepped onto the bridge itself. Our footsteps echoed strangely in the still air, creating multiple layers of sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The bridge was about 30 feet long, but it felt like we were walking across an endless chasm. With each step, the humming grew louder, and I began to make out what sounded almost like voices within the sound, whispered words I couldn't quite understand, spoken in tones of pain and desperation. Halfway across, Marcus stopped and pulled out his camera. The flash illuminated the entire bridge for a split second, creating stark shadows that seemed to writhe and dance even after the light had faded. In that brief moment of illumination, I thought I saw something that made my blood run cold, a figure standing at the far end of the bridge, watching us. "Did you see that?" I grabbed Marcus's arm, my fingers digging into his jacket. "See what?" He was already reviewing the photo on his camera's LCD screen. There was something at the end of the bridge. Marcus looked up, shining his flashlight toward the far end of the structure. The beam revealed nothing but empty roadway and the dark line of trees beyond. "I don't see anything," he said, but I noticed he lowered his voice to barely above a whisper. I stared into the darkness beyond his flashlight beam, my eyes straining to pick out any movement or shape that didn't belong. For a moment, there was nothing, and I began to convince myself that I had imagined it. Then, just at the edge of the light, I saw it again, a tall, thin silhouette that seemed to flicker in and out of existence like a bad television signal. "Marcus," I whispered, pointing with a shaking hand. This time, he saw it too. The figure stood motionless at the end of the bridge, and even though I couldn't make out any features, I could feel it watching us. There was something deeply wrong about its proportions, too tall, too thin, with arms that hung almost to its knees. "Holy shit," Marcus breathed, raising his camera again. But as soon as the flash fired, the figure was gone. Not faded away, not moved out of sight, gone, as if it had never been there at all. The humming from below the bridge suddenly stopped, plunging us into a silence so complete it felt like being buried alive. Even the wind had died, leaving the air perfectly still around us. In that silence, we heard something that made every hair on my body stand on end, the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps coming from beneath the bridge. "We need to get out of here," I said, backing toward the car, but Marcus was already moving in the opposite direction, toward the source of the footsteps. "Are you insane?" I hissed, but he was climbing over the broken railing, preparing to descend the steep embankment to the creek below. "This is exactly what we came for," he called back, his voice tight with excitement and fear. "Help me get down there." Every rational part of my mind screamed at me to run, to get in the car and drive back to campus and never speak of this night again. But Marcus was my friend, and I couldn't abandon him. Cursing under my breath, I followed him over the railing. The slope was steeper than it looked, covered in loose gravel and dead leaves that made every step treacherous. Halfway down, I lost my footing and slid the rest of the way on my back, coming to rest in a tangle of thorny bushes at the creek's edge. The water was maybe 4 feet wide and shallow, but it was so dark it might as well have been the depths of the ocean. Marcus was already wading into the creek, his flashlight beam playing across the underside of the bridge. The concrete supports were covered in a dark substance that glistened wetly in the light, and it definitely wasn't algae. Long, dark streaks ran down the pillars and disappeared into the black water, as if something had been repeatedly drained of its contents and left to drip. "Jesus Christ, Marcus, look at this place," I whispered, finally joining him in the creek. The water was ice cold and had a metallic smell that made my stomach turn. But Marcus wasn't listening. He was staring up at something carved into the concrete support nearest the bank. I followed his gaze and saw what had captured his attention: names, dozens of them, carved into the concrete in rough, hurried letters. Some were so old they were barely visible, while others looked fresh, the concrete dust still white around the edges. "These are the victims," Marcus said, his voice hollow. "Look at the dates." I moved closer, shining my flashlight on the carvings. The names went back decades: Mary Collins 1923. James Wright 1931. Susan Hayes 1947. But what made my blood freeze was that the dates didn't stop in the distant past. There were recent names too: David Martinez 2018. Jennifer Thompson 2021, and at the very bottom, so fresh the concrete dust hadn't even been washed away by rain, Marcus Riley, followed by today's date. "Marcus," I said, my voice cracking. "Marcus, look at this." But when I turned around, he was gone. I spun in a complete circle, my flashlight beam sweeping across the creek and the embankment, but there was no sign of him. The water where he had been standing moments before was perfectly still, showing no sign of disturbance. "Marcus!" I called out, no longer caring about being quiet. "Marcus, where are you?" My voice echoed off the bridge supports and died in the surrounding forest. The only response was the return of that low humming, rising up from the water around my feet. As the sound grew louder, I realized with growing horror that it wasn't coming from the water at all, it was coming from beneath it. I backed toward the shore, my flashlight beam darting frantically across the surface of the creek. That's when I saw them, faces just beneath the water, pale and bloated, with eyes that reflected my light like mirrors. Dozens of them, reaching up toward the surface with waterlogged fingers, their mouths open in silent screams. I stumbled backward, falling hard on the rocky shore, but I couldn't look away from the creek. The faces were rising, breaking the surface now, and I could see that they weren't quite human anymore. Their features were distorted, elongated, as if they had been stretched and twisted by their time in that dark water. And among them, I saw Marcus. His face was already beginning to change, his eyes taking on that same reflective quality as the others. He looked at me with an expression of infinite sadness and opened his mouth as if to speak, but only that terrible humming emerged. I scrambled up the embankment, not caring about the rocks that cut my hands or the thorns that tore at my clothes. Behind me, I could hear splashing as something large emerged from the creek, followed by the wet slapping sound of bare feet on stone. At the top of the embankment, I threw myself over the bridge railing and ran toward my car, fumbling for my keys with hands that shook so badly I could barely control them. The humming was getting louder, and I could hear those wet footsteps on the bridge behind me, moving faster now. I managed to get the car started just as something slammed into the rear window, spider-webbing the glass. In the rearview mirror, I caught a glimpse of a tall, impossibly thin figure standing on the bridge, watching as I sped away. It raised one elongated arm in what might have been a wave, or might have been a gesture of promise, that it would see me again. I didn't stop driving until I reached the campus, and even then, I sat in the parking lot for 20 minutes, engine running, afraid to turn off the lights. When I finally made it to my dorm room, I locked the door and shoved my desk in front of it for good measure. But safety was an illusion. Over the next few days, I tried to convince myself that what I had experienced was some kind of breakdown, a shared hallucination brought on by stress and too much caffeine. Marcus was just missing, maybe he had gotten lost in the woods, or fallen and hit his head. The police would find him. Except they didn't. The search teams combed the area around Stuckey's bridge for 3 days and found no trace of him. When I told them about our visit to the bridge, they looked at me with a mixture of pity and suspicion. The official report listed Marcus as a missing person, possibly a runaway, though everyone who knew him understood how ridiculous that was. I tried to return to normal life, but normal no longer existed for me. Every night, I dreamed of that bridge, of faces beneath dark water, of a tall figure that watched and waited. During the day, I found myself researching the history of the area, looking for any explanation that didn't involve the supernatural. What I found was worse than I had expected. The disappearances around Stuckey's bridge didn't start with the legendary hermit in the 1920s, they went back much further. Native American oral histories spoke of a place where the water spirits took the unwary. Early settlers reported missing travelers and strange lights near the creek. Even after Jeremiah Stuckey was supposedly caught and killed by a posse in 1934, people continued to vanish in the area. But it was a newspaper article from 1978 that made me realize the true horror of what we had stumbled into. A team of state investigators, sent to examine the bridge for possible reconstruction, had discovered something that was quickly covered up and buried in official files. While examining the concrete supports, they had found that the dark stains weren't rust or algae, they were human blood, some of it relatively fresh. More disturbing still, when they used ground-penetrating radar to examine the creek bed, they found dozens of metallic objects buried in the mud. Objects that turned out to be jewelry, watches, and other personal effects spanning nearly a century. The investigation was quietly shut down, the bridge was declared structurally sound, and the files were sealed. But one of the investigators, reaching retirement age, had spoken to a reporter off the record. He described finding carved names under the bridge, names that matched missing persons reports going back decades. I knew I had to go back. 3 weeks after Marcus's disappearance, I found myself once again driving through the dark back roads toward Stuckey's bridge. This time, I came prepared. I had a better flashlight, a waterproof camera, and most importantly, a rope tied around my waist with the other end secured to my car's trailer hitch. If something tried to take me, it would have to drag my Honda Civic along. The bridge looked exactly the same as I remembered, a dark void spanning the creek, absorbing light and sound. But this time, I approached it differently. Instead of walking across, I went directly to the embankment and descended to the creek below. The names were still there, carved into the concrete support, but now I noticed something I had missed before. They weren't just random victims, they formed a pattern. Every few years, sometimes every few months, new names appeared. And they weren't carved by the victims themselves, the lettering was too consistent, too deliberate. Something was keeping a record. I waded into the creek, fighting every instinct that screamed at me to run. The water was just as cold and metallic smelling as before, but this time I was ready for what I might find beneath the surface. I took a deep breath and ducked my head under the water. What I saw in the beam of my waterproof flashlight defied comprehension. The creek bed wasn't natural, it had been excavated and shaped, forming a series of interconnected chambers that extended far beyond what should have been possible. And in those chambers, preserved by the cold, mineral-rich water, were the remains of decades of victims. They weren't just bones, the bodies were perfectly preserved, their faces frozen in expressions of terror and anguish. Some were dressed in clothes from decades past, others in modern clothing. All of them had been arranged with deliberate care, positioned as if they were sleeping, waiting for something. At the center of it all was a structure that shouldn't have existed, what looked like an altar made of the same concrete as the bridge supports, but far older. Carved into its surface were symbols that hurt to look at directly, geometric patterns that seemed to shift and writhe even in the steady beam of my flashlight. And standing behind the altar, as if he had been waiting for me, was Marcus. But it wasn't Marcus, not anymore. His skin had taken on a pale, translucent quality, and his eyes reflected light like those of the other faces I had seen. When he opened his mouth to speak, that terrible humming emerged, but underneath it, I could make out words. "He's been waiting," Marcus said, his voice layered with harmonics that made my teeth ache. "The Guardian. He's been waiting so long." That's when I saw it, the thing that had been masquerading as Old Man Stuckey all these years. It emerged from the deepest chamber like a nightmare-given form, tall and impossibly thin, with skin that looked like wet concrete and eyes that were holes in reality itself. This was no human hermit who had gone mad with isolation. This was something far older, something that had been feeding off human misery and death since long before the bridge was built. It spoke without words, directly into my mind, and I understood everything. The bridge wasn't just a place where it hunted, it was a gateway, a thin spot between our world and somewhere else. The Guardian, as Marcus had called it, was both jailer and prisoner, bound to this place but unable to leave. It sustained itself on the life force of those it claimed, adding their essence to its own twisted existence. The names carved into the bridge support weren't a record of victims, they were a menu, a catalog of meals consumed. And my name was already there, waiting to be filled in with today's date. I tried to surface, to flee, but my body wouldn't obey. The Guardian's influence was too strong, and I felt myself being drawn toward that horrible altar. The preserved corpses around me began to move, reaching out with hands that should have been stiff with rigor mortis but moved with fluid grace. That's when the rope around my waist went taut. My car's engine was still running above, and the Guardian's power apparently didn't extend to internal combustion engines. The rope pulled me backward, away from the altar and its unholy congregation. The guardian let out a sound that was part scream, part grinding stone, but it couldn't follow me beyond the boundaries of its underwater domain. I broke the surface gasping and choking, then scrambled up the embankment as fast as the rope would allow. Behind me, the creek erupted in a waterspout that reached almost to the bottom of the bridge, and I could hear that terrible humming rising to a shriek of rage. I didn't look back as I threw myself into my car and gunned the engine. In the rearview mirror, I could see dark shapes moving on the bridge, but I was already too far away to make out details. I never reported what I found under Stuckey's bridge. Who would believe me? Instead, I transferred to a college on the other side of the country and tried to forget. But forgetting is impossible when something like that has marked you. The dreams never stopped. Every night, I found myself back in that underwater chamber, watching the guardian arrange its victims with the patience of something that had eternity to work with. And every morning, I woke with the taste of metal in my mouth and the sound of that terrible humming in my ears. It took me years to understand what had really happened that night. The guardian hadn't tried to kill me, it had let me go. Not out of mercy, but because it wanted a witness, someone to carry the story forward and ensure that new victims would continue to find their way to the bridge. I was its unwitting recruiter. Even now, writing this account, I know that some of you reading it will be drawn to visit Stuckey's bridge. You'll tell yourself it's just curiosity, just a desire to see if the story is true. You'll make the same rationalizations I once made, convince yourself that you're too smart to fall for local folklore. Don't. The guardian is patient. It has waited in that place for longer than human civilization has existed, and it will wait long after we're gone. It doesn't need to actively hunt, people come to it, drawn by stories and dares and the irresistible human compulsion to poke at things that should be left alone. I've spent the last 15 years researching similar places around the world, and I've found dozens of them. Bridges, wells, caves, and other locations where the boundary between worlds has worn thin. They all have their own guardians, their own methods of claiming victims, but they all serve the same purpose: they're feeding grounds for things that exist in the spaces between reality. Some nights, when the dreams are particularly vivid, I can feel the guardian's attention turning toward me across the miles. It's still waiting, still hungry, and it knows that eventually, I'll return. The compulsion is always there, a constant whisper in the back of my mind urging me to drive south, to finish what I started. Maybe someday I will. Maybe the pull will become too strong to resist, and I'll find myself standing on that bridge again, looking down into the dark water where my friend Marcus waits with all the others. But not today. Today, I'm writing this warning, adding my voice to the few others who have encountered such places and lived to tell about it. If you're reading this and feeling that familiar tug of curiosity, that desire to see for yourself, I'm begging you, don't. Find another bridge to photograph. Pick a different legend to investigate. The Guardian has enough servants already, and it doesn't need any more names carved into that concrete pillar. But if you do go, if the compulsion proves too strong to resist, remember this: take someone with you who can pull you back. Tie a rope around your waist. Keep your car running. And whatever you do, don't go into the water. Because once you see what lies beneath Stuckey's bridge, you'll never be free of it. You'll spend the rest of your life fighting the urge to return, to complete the transformation that Marcus and all the others have undergone. And someday, inevitably, you'll lose that fight. The Guardian is patient. It has all the time in the world. And it's waiting for you. I'm writing this final entry from a hotel room in Montgomery, Alabama. I told myself I was just passing through on business, that the route I chose had nothing to do with its proximity to Enterprise. But we both know that's a lie, don't we? I can feel it calling to me, stronger now than it has in years. The Guardian knows I'm close, and it's reaching out across the miles with tendrils of influence that wrap around my thoughts like chains. Every hour I stay in this area, the compulsion grows stronger. I've checked the local missing persons reports, and the pattern continues. College students mostly, drawn by urban legends and internet stories. They disappear near the bridge, and their cases go cold within weeks. The cycle continues, just as it has for decades, just as it will for decades to come. Part of me wants to drive to the local police station, to tell them everything I know about what lurks beneath that bridge. But what would I tell them? That an ancient entity is harvesting souls to sustain its existence between dimensions? They'd commit me to a psychiatric facility, and the Guardian would continue its work undisturbed. No, the only way to stop it would be to face it directly, to find some way to break the cycle. But I know how that story ends, with my name carved into concrete and my face joining the others beneath the dark water. As I write these words, I can hear something scratching at my hotel room window. Probably just tree branches in the wind, but I know better. The Guardian's influence extends beyond its physical domain, especially to those who have been marked by its presence. I should leave. I should get in my car right now and drive as far from this place as possible. But my hands are shaking too badly to hold the keys, and the sound of that terrible humming is growing louder in my mind. If you're reading this, it means I didn't make it out. It means I succumbed to the call that has haunted me for 15 years and returned to the place where my friend disappeared. My final act of free will is to upload this account to every urban legend website and forum I can find, hoping that my story might save at least one person from sharing my fate. Don't let my sacrifice be in vain. Don't go to Stuckey's Bridge. Don't become another name carved in concrete, another face beneath the water. The Guardian is waiting. And now, God help me, so am I. This account was found uploaded to multiple websites from an IP address traced to a hotel in Montgomery, Alabama. The author, identified as Michael Preston, 34, was reported missing 3 days later. His rental car was found abandoned near a rural bridge outside Enterprise, Mississippi. Despite extensive searches, no trace of Mr. Preston has been found. Local authorities continue to investigate.
Hey everyone, thanks so much for listening. If you enjoyed the video, please hit that like and subscribe button, and then share with your friends. Your support helps us grow and create even more awesome content. We appreciate you being part of the journey. Here are a couple more videos for you to check out.